All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for being here. For those folks in the room, I've warned most of you, but it's pretty cold in here today. I apologize. We are working on the HVAC of this building, and this room seems to be the last one to be getting the heat, so I apologize to all of you. So if you need to move away from the fan, you can do that now. um, Again, thank you all for being here. This is a hybrid event. We have folks in the room and we have folks online. Thank you both. My name is Cinnamon Moffat, and I'll be your host for this event. A couple of logistics for folks online. If you haven't joined us or you haven't joined us in a little while, feel free to put any questions you might have into the chat box. Your cameras and mics have been disabled for today's talk, but we have a volunteer in the room, Roseanne, who will help navigate all of those questions and make sure that we address any troubles you're having or ask any questions for today's speaker. For all of you here in the room, also thank you for being here. Just a quick reminder, I was a little late on putting out the sign up sheet, but if you can sign out or sign up when you exit, if you haven't already, that allows me to justify buying cookies and coffee. That's the only reason we use it for. So that's really helpful for me. So thank you very much. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements and then we'll get rolling here. So next week, we have a lunch and learn. We have somebody that's coming back to us, Elena Alexander, who was here for a little while, went and is now teaching in New Zealand and will be back just for the week. That's going to be talking about their work with cetaceans and possums and chickadees and everything in between. So that will be in the library seminar room at noon on December 10th, which is a Wednesday. Then we have next week's seminar, which is December 11th in this room, when Dan Helene, director of Pac Wave, will be giving us an update on the Pac Wave project. So if you haven't been keeping up with that, or you're just curious or have questions for him, please come on back, same place, same time next week. And if you're curious about any of our Hatfield events, you can go onto the Hatfield website, go to the events page. Everything you need to join us either in person or online is there. And just a reminder, we're still doing our food drive. So right outside the door, there is a bucket. It will stay there for the next month or so. If you bring any canned foods, the foods go to the pantry directly located here at Hatfield to support those that are struggling over the holidays. So feel free to do that at any time. But I want to just knock it off and start introductions with today's speaker. Most of you know Susanne Brander. Susanne received her PhD in toxicology and pharmacology at the University UC Davis in 2011 and is currently associate professor in the College of Agricultural Sciences here at Oregon State University and is located in her lab is here at Hatfield. Brander's interdisciplinary research focuses on the occurrence of biological effects of stressors such as micro and nanoplastics, microfibers, and endocrine disruptor compounds on aquatic and terrestrial organisms. She also serves as the Green River Science Panel Advisory Team for the California Department of Toxic Substance Control and is a member of the Scientist Coalition for the UNEP Global Plastics Treaty Negotiations. At the end, very soon, of 2025 this year, she'll be moving to a position as the project director of science for Pew's new Safer Chemical Program in Washington, D.C. So this will be our last formal presentation from Susanne Brander in her current role. She will be staying with us as a courtesy faculty for a little while longer. So today is not the last day we'll see her, but role is changing. So we're really excited to have you present. So I'll hand it off. Thank you very much.
Cinnamon, thank you so much for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming today. I know it's a bit gray and rainy outside, although that's kind of Oregon this time of year, so maybe it's okay. Today I'm going to give a 60,000-foot view of the work that we've done here at Hatfield during my time at OSU. I started at OSU in 2017 in fall, and then prior to that I had been faculty for a few years at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And our focus throughout has been mainly on understanding the occurrence of microplastics and microfibers in the coastal environment in organisms living in coastal ecosystems here off the coast of Oregon and Washington and California. And then in the lab, we've been trying to translate what we found in the field and do exposures that are informed by actual environmental occurrence in the lab to understand how organisms are being affected. The talk won't be all doom and gloom. I'll talk a bit about what we know and what we still need to find out. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Global Plastics Treaty and sort of things to look forward to in the coming year, as well as efforts that are happening in the US and at the state level to advance our knowledge on plastic pollution and how to reduce our exposure to it. But before I get into all that, I definitely want to thank all of the wonderful people that I've had a chance to work with here. And I don't have pictures of all of them on this slide, but the students and staff in my lab, in collaborators' labs like Stacy Harper's lab, who's been a big collaborator of mine on plastics work, as well as funding sources, colleagues at Portland State University like Elise Granick, and the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, which I've been a part of for the past about 2.5 years now. So if you're sitting in this room, you're likely pretty well aware that we use way too much plastic. And I thought that this graphic by Greta Rundell, which is an organization based in Norway, does a really good job of kind of visually depicting the magnitude of the increase. You go back to 1950, we're at 2 million tons, and then you go out to 2060 projections and just orders of magnitude higher. And that's kind of where we still sit right now. If you're aware of the global treaty negotiations, you know that consensus has not been reached yet. And so we're still on this trajectory to meet that unfortunate number unless we do something. The good news is that we're trying to do something. And this is a graphic that is kind of hot off the presses. It actually came out in a report that was released yesterday by the Pew Charitable Trust's plastic pollution program. They released their second Breaking the Plastic Wave report. They released the first one back in about 2022. And the purpose of this report is to kind of give a status of where we are globally and also where we are in the US with production of plastic and actions to try to limit production and exposure. And right now things, they didn't mince any words here. You've got total plastic pollution at the top in red, and then they break it down between plastics that are burned, so a lot of incineration, which contributes to climate change, as well as breaking it down between terrestrial pollution and aquatic pollution. And you'll notice that terrestrial pollution is a bit higher than aquatic, which makes sense. Most of the plastic comes from us on land. And then if we're talking about sources, and this is information that's been out for a little while, but I think it's still a little bit tricky to wrap our heads around, because when you think of plastic, you think of a plastic bottle or a plastic straw. But as we go out and we look at sources of the micro-sized stuff in the environment, most of what we're seeing is synthetic fibers, or also anthropogenic fibers like cotton. And then second in line are car tires. And then right behind that is city dust. So a lot of what's actually being mobilized and detected, not just in the ocean, but in other types of samples, are fibers from our clothing. And I thought as a visual aid, I would pass this around. About 2 years ago, I gave a talk, and everyone in the audience took some Scotch tape and got fibers off of their clothing and marked what they were wearing. And so I just thought I'd pass this around because it's kind of informative, and it'll make some of the data I present later make more sense. And most of what I'll talk about today is going to be in the very small size fraction. So if you look at the definition of a microplastic by, say, NOAA, for example, they will define it as a plastic that is less than 5 millimeters in size. But frankly, most of what we're finding in shark stomachs, sediment samples, water samples, biosolids, we'll talk a little bit about that, is much, much smaller. Most of what we're seeing is under 1 millimeter in size, so micron. And then in collaboration with Dr. Stacy Harper on main campus, we can also even test out nano-sized particles which can only be seen with a scanning electron microscope. But that's really some of the most concerning stuff, is at that very small size fraction, because those particles are small enough to move around inside the body, and they're also small enough to cause more negative effects in tissues and in cells. So a lot of what I'll talk about today kind of falls under the category of plastic chemicals. And I realize this is an extremely busy figure, so no need to take in everything. This was from a paper that came out in Nature a few months ago. A group in Norway called Plastchem has been trying to characterize all the different chemicals that are involved across the entire life cycle of plastics. So sometimes when we think of plastic, we only think of the end of life. We think of the landfill or of the small amount that's recycled, which is like 5% in the US, or we think of the fibers that we might find in our laundry lint trap, for example. But a lot of the chemicals that are used in plastic production are being used for the extraction of raw materials. They're being used in production, in transport. The factories have chemicals that they have to use to keep the machines lubricated. Those get into plastics. And so the Plastchem project estimated that there were upwards of 16,000 different chemicals used from start to finish. And they also estimated that each plastic item can have up to 400 chemicals that have either been used to make it or touched it or absorbed to it at some point in the process. And the other thing I think that's important to remember is that the particles themselves are also chemicals, because plastics are made up of monomers, and I won't make this an organic chemistry class, but each one of those monomers is a chemical in and of itself. And sometimes those monomers can also be harmful, like styrene that makes up polystyrene is thought to be carcinogenic. So when we're talking about plastic chemicals, we're not just thinking about the particles or the chemicals, we're thinking about the whole, kind of everything falls under that umbrella. So my talk today is going to have three main parts to it. First, I'm going to talk a bit about work that we've done on occurrence, and I'll focus mostly on recent work and thinking about how what we've learned about food webs and how plastics are accumulating in food webs off the coast of Oregon and Washington. Response data from the lab, from lab exposures. And then I'll finish up with some good news about how we're starting to mitigate and thinking about ways to regulate production of plastics and all of the different chemicals that are used. So a lot of what we do upstairs on the second floor in that little room, there's a glass wall on one side, so you might have walked by it and seen people leaning over microscopes in there, is isolation, digestion, and verification of plastic particles. All right, you got it. And this is a really kind of long process. And so we've designed and developed methods to do this with lots of different sample types, sometimes in collaboration with other labs. So we're all kind of trying to arrive at the same answer in the same way. But it's really time-consuming work, because you're sometimes taking a really complex sample. Like right now we're working with compost, and you're trying to just get the particles, the synthetic or human-made particles out of that. And so after digestion and microscopy, we use spectroscopy to identify the material type. So we can say this is polyester, or this is cotton, or this is nylon, for example. And so the folks in my lab spend a lot of time staring at things like this. This is a filter that has little individual boxes on it, so we can track where the particles are. And they're characterizing things like, you know, the black thing is a tire particle, and then there's a fiber up there. And that little green sphere is a practice particle we put in there on purpose so we can track how much we're recovering, so we know what our recovery rate is. So that's a lot of what we do. And the results that we've gotten from that type of work, I'm going to show a few examples from different studies. We were really lucky to be able to collaborate with NOAA through Scott Happel's lab a couple of years ago. And Olivia Boisin published two papers looking at microplastics and fibers in myctophids. And we were able to get samples from both Washington and Oregon that had been archived. Apparently there are freezers full of fish, and so we took advantage of some of those freezers full of fish. And what she found was that about 3/4 of those myctophids, which are really important prey for larger fishes and for squid, contained fibers. And that was actually relatively low compared to some of the other sample types we've looked at. But if you scale that up to, like, say, what a tuna would eat, what a large fish would eat, it ends up being on the order of millions of fibers per year because they have to eat a lot of these small organisms. And it was mostly microfibers that we found. And then she also was able to get some samples of 3 different species of myctophids from 2 museum collections through a collaboration with Brian Sedlauskas, who had been faculty in Fisheries and Wildlife. And she found, not surprisingly, a small increase in the number of fibers as we went across time, and a slight increase in the number of synthetic fibers as we got closer to present day. Another recent study, which is in prep right now, and Maddie English is a student in the Big Fish Lab here at Hatfield. We got to collaborate with them, and she was able to get samples of salmon sharks from different life stages. When they go out and do their sampling on the boat, they end up encountering, I guess, fishermen who catch salmon sharks via their bycatch. And so she was able to digest the stomachs, which are gigantic. As someone who really runs more of a small fish lab, this is one of the biggest things I've ever seen in my lab, like basketball sized. She looked at the stomach linings of these sharks, and what she found was really interesting in that the young of the year had significantly lower numbers of particles in the stomach lining compared to the adults. And then the juveniles were kind of in the middle. And if you fit a line to this, it is significant, even though there's quite a bit of variability. So we're seeing this indication that even though some research shows that microplastics and fibers don't bioaccumulate, for longer-lived species, and depending on the size of the particles, there might be some accumulation over time. And then lastly, another study we did, which really looked at that food web connection and specifically looking at Pacific gray whales. And this was in collaboration with Lee Torres's lab and the Marine Mammal Institute, and Lisa Hildebrand worked quite a bit on this study as well. We collected zooplankton, so mysid shrimp and copepods, in collaboration with the Torres lab, and looked at particle content in those zooplankton. And then, of course, they have such a wealth of data on these Pacific gray whales, what they eat, how much they eat, where they, what spaces they use. And so we were able to connect our 2 data sets and estimate that a gestating gray whale off the coast of Oregon, in that Oregon kind of pod, whatever you would call it, that's that group that actually hangs out around the coast in the summers, could be ingesting over 20 million particles per day because their dietary requirement is so high. So they're eating these tiny little mysid shrimp, and they have to eat millions of them per day. So even if each of those mysids has half a particle on average, you're still scaling that up to a really kind of enormous amount. And this is just a picture of one of those mysids with a fiber inside of it. We brought some of them into the lab and confirmed that they would ingest microfibers in a lab setting. So lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent study that we did in collaboration with Elise Granick at Portland State University. This was a study funded by Oregon Sea Grant. And we looked at 6 different commercial fishery species that are important to Oregon, also important to Washington State as well. Some of them are also caught in California. And in this case, we wanted not just to think about ingestion, but we wanted to think about where else those particles end up in the fish. And so instead of looking at gut contents, we decided to look at fillets, to look at mussel in all 6 of these species. And sure enough, in all 6, we mostly found fibers, and we found those in the mussel tissue. And what we think is going on, and again, this was after controlling for background contamination, making sure we weren't, shedding fibers into the samples themselves, We think that those fibers are small enough in the width dimension that they can translocate from the gut into other tissues. This has also been shown in human tissues more recently, that sometimes fibers are moving around in humans as well. But there's a number of different mechanisms, which I won't get into the weeds on, but these are all things that can happen basically in the gut wall that allow particles that might be a little larger than expected to move across into other tissues. So this is something to think about in terms of our exposure when we're eating fish or when we're eating any other kind of meat. It's not just fish, but also to think about how that informs what might be happening in us too. So based on all of that work that we've been doing and the data we've been collecting, most of our studies on responses on toxicity testing have focused either on fibers or tire wear particles, because those are really the top two plastics that are being found in the environment. We haven't found a lot of tire particles in our current studies, because a lot of what we do is study animals that live up in the upper part of the water column. And so those tire particles tend to sink out into the sediments. With our sediment studies, we do find a lot of tire particles. So we're going to talk about tire wear first, and then I'll talk about fiber experiments after that. But kind of bigger picture, this work on toxicity testing was funded by the National Science Foundation and has been done in collaboration with the Harper Lab at OSU. Her lab has run studies on freshwater, early life stage organisms, and then my lab has been the kind of saltier half of the collaboration. And so I'm going to give some examples from studies with mysid shrimp, studies with silversides, and then studies with Daphnia, which are they're a freshwater water flea that's very commonly used for this kind of testing. The objective here was really to focus on the smaller particles, because when we started this research back at the end of 2019, most of the microplastics work that had been done was done on commercially purchased particles that are basically perfect spheres. Nothing we find in the environment is a perfect sphere. It's a lot of fibers, a lot of irregularly shaped things, and so they're going to behave differently inside an animal than a perfect circle is. They're going to be harder to get rid of. They might be more likely to get trapped in the gut tissue, in the intestine, for example. And so we use these few model species to think about things like growth impacts or food dilution, meaning that when you have foreign particles in your gut, you're not going to eat as much other food, behavioral changes, changes in gene expression, and reproductive impacts too. So the biggest hurdle with this work was to figure out how to make our own particles, because you can't just go out and buy tire particles, right? Or buy fibers that look like what you find in the environment. And so the Harper Lab used cryomilling, so basically like a big cylinder with liquid nitrogen. You put your straws or your tire in there and you grind it up and then size fractionate it. And then we developed a method which is shown down here. I'll play the video again, to make microfibers with a cryotome. And so this allows you basically take a strand of your polyester or whatever you're going to make fibers from and cut it at known increments, so you can make a lot of them for an exposure. So we did that with polyester. We've done it with cotton, nylon, and I think hemp as well. So I'm going to give an example of some of the tire studies first. This is from a review a group of us published in 2024. You may have heard about, you've probably heard about the impact on salmon from the chemical 6-PPD in Washington state, the urban stormwater mortality syndrome, where certain species of salmon are very sensitive to exposure to urban runoff, and that urban runoff, a compound called 6-PPD has been isolated as the cause. But there's also just the fact that there are lots of these tire particles. It's not just the 6-PPD, it's the particles themselves and the hundreds of other chemicals that are in those particles. And so that's what this review gets into, and all the concerns about how do we reduce production? How do we deal with tire waste? How do we mitigate, right? What do we do we have to drive cars, we have to get places. So how do we get around that? But Clarissa Raguso, who was here at Hatfield for about a year and a half and is now doing a postdoc at Portland State in the Granick Lab, did some work trying to address the more holistic question about just the particles themselves. And so we were able to get particles from the US Tire Manufacturers Association. They actually were sending out particle mixtures to researchers all over the country that were representative of the mix of cars and trucks that are driven in the US. So we had a mixture that had like some tire from trucks, from vans, from regular vehicles, city buses. And she took those particles and she weathered some of them under UV light in a controlled way, and some of them were new. And she exposed both silverside, so larval fish, and mysid shrimp, which are similar to the mysid shrimp off the coast here. And she exposed them to see if their growth was affected. And then she also measured ingestion. How many of those particles were they taking up? And what she found was that the animals were much more likely to ingest the weathered particles, especially the shrimp. We think that's because the weathered particles may have less of a chemical smell, especially for the fish being able to detect that. And also they're more likely to grow biofilms on them or have food kind of getting stuck in the cracks, so they seem more like food. But that was a really interesting finding because if you think about it, most of the particles that are going to be out in the environment are going to be somewhat weathered. And then what she found in correlation with the ingestion was that the more the animals ingested, the more their growth was inhibited. And so we saw that growth was more inhibited with the weathered particles than it was with the new particles. So there's a lot of concern about 6-ppd from the new particles, but there might be an additional concern with the intake of the weathered particles. She also looked at behavioral responses, and this is something we do a lot of with different stressors, including pesticides too. And we look at things like time spent bursting, cruising, freezing behavior, because all of those changes in behavior are indicators of differences in how that animal is interacting with its surroundings. And it can be an indicator of a stress response. And what Clarissa found there was that both species were affected, but interestingly in different ways. The mysid shrimp were more impacted by the weathered particles in terms of their behavior. And then the fish were more impacted by the new particles and by the leachate from the new particles. So in alignment with other fish species that are affected by the leachate. And so something we need to really think about, and we've seen this with other studies too, is that species can sometimes be all over the map in terms of how they respond to plastics and to the chemicals that are associated with them. In the Harper lab, they looked at reproduction, and Daphnia are really convenient because they'll just reproduce in the lab over and over again and have a very short generation time. And what they found was that long-term exposure to the nanorubber particles and the micro-rubber particles interfered with reproduction. And so they saw this kind of multi-generational effect, at least at higher concentrations, that we need to look into more and think about how that might be happening in other species too. So more stuff on tires that we did that I won't have time to talk about, but I wanted to have a chance to talk a little bit about fibers, because again, above and beyond any other particle type, this is what we find the most of. We find polyester, but we also, to some extent, and you can see it from the board that's being passed around, we find so much human modified cotton in our samples. And this is after we correct for cotton that might be in the air in the building or might be shedding from our clothes. And it kind of in some ways matches that 60%, 60% cotton, 40% polyester blend that you see in so many things. And this aligns with the increase in global consumption of fibers. And fibers, it turns out they're really easy to transport. They're transported in air, they're transported in water. For that myctophid study that we did, for the ones that were caught far offshore, we would only see microfibers in them. If we caught myctophids closer to land, we would see other particle types. And so really the fibers are able to be transported across much larger distances, and other studies have seen that too. And I think sometimes it's hard to think about fibers as also being plastic. And you know, it's not something that we naturally associate fibers with. And I've even had this conversation with other scientists. But it turns out that some of the most common plastic types that we have, like polyethylene terephthalate, that's what plastic water bottles are made out of. But if you use a STIR to look at the material, you get the same spectra from a PET water bottle that you do from a polyester t-shirt. It's the same chemical. And then polyamide is what nylon is, but polyamide is also used to make like the plastics in your car, some of the plastics in your car. So a lot of, and what this figure is showing is kind of the chemicals that are used in those common plastics that are used to make our clothes, and how there's a lot of overlap in this Venn diagram here with things that we often think of as being worse, like PVC. A lot of the same chemicals are used across those different plastic types, the hard plastics that are used for, you know, the things we think about as plastic, and the synthetic clothing items that we wear. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different studies here. And because we were finding so much cotton in our environmental samples, like, well, we have to test this in the lab, because at this point back in 2022, when we were running this study, which was done by Sam Reen, who was a postdoc with us, there hadn't been a lot of work done on cotton. So we decided to compare cotton with polyester, and we also looked at polypropylene, like from marine ropes. And again, what we found was a difference between species, that the mysid shrimp were affected, their growth was affected by ingesting cotton as well as the synthetic fibers. And then the fish were a little bit less sensitive. They were affected by the synthetic fibers, but not by the cotton. And luckily, the cotton wasn't as bad in either species as the polyester. So we can still wear cotton, but we need to think about where it's coming from, how it's been treated, and also think about ways to just not put as much out into the environment. And then Sarah Hutton, who did her PhD in toxicology here and finished a couple of years ago, she looked across a bunch of different particle types, including microfibers. And what she found was that new microfibers were the only one of these many different treatments that affected fish growth over a longer exposure period. So in the toxicology world, and a short exposure is usually 4 to 7 days long, a chronic long-term exposure is 21 to 28 days long, which isn't really that long, but you know, comparatively it's longer. And so what we think is happening here is maybe a combination of the chemicals and the particles for the microfibers, and that they're interacting together to cause that reduced growth. Whereas the other particle types, so you've got tire particles here, you've got PLA, which is a bioplastic, and then weathered microfibers, we're not seeing, or we're seeing that the fish are adapting to those particles over time. But then she looked at gene expression and she saw something pretty different. And I know this is pretty busy, so I'll give you the take-home message here. So over here, you've got 6 different kinds of particles. You've got new microfibers, weathered microfibers, up at the top, nano tire particles, micro polylactic acid, which is a bioplastic, and nano polylactic acid, which is weathered. And what you see pretty consistently here is that the nano-sized particles across the different plastic types and the microfibers that are weathered, they're causing the same types of changes in gene expression. And interestingly, we mostly saw changes in things like muscle function and muscle cell assembly, which indicates those nanoparticles are moving around in the fish potentially. And we were wondering why we were seeing that. And so we did, Lauren Kashwabera, who is a PhD student now in my lab, did some SEM imaging. And she saw that the polyester microfibers, after they're weathered under UV light, they start to break off little nano-sized polyester particles. And so this is something that needs a lot more exploration, but we think that mechanistically, the weathered microfibers act a bit like nano tire particles and nano PLA, and there's like a size fractionation thing going on here. The gene expression we're seeing is affected more by size than by the polymer type. So we know a lot about what's happening in fish. We know a lot about what's happening in invertebrates, because that's really where the field of microplastics research got its start. The discovery of the North Pacific garbage patch kind of kicked things off, and it seems like the funding stream started in the ocean is gradually kind of moving inland. And so over the past 5 or so years, there's been a lot more research on human health, and we're finally starting to see some connections between what's been found in fish and what's being detected in humans, and what kind of correlations are being made in the field of epidemiology in terms of effects on humans and occurrence of plastics in certain tissues in the human body. And so there are similarities. Not surprisingly, we've seen this with other types of pollutants as well. And then we also know now that plastics are in the brain. So what we've been seeing in terms of behavioral changes in the fish, could that be because those plastics are also getting into the brain of the fish when they're exposed? So a few of us got together, including Stacy Harper and Jamie DeWitt, who are both here at OSU, and wrote a review earlier this year, because we really wanted to kind of look not just at micro and nanoplastics, but also other kinds of pollutants and what similarities we were seeing between different taxonomic groups. And in some ways, this isn't new information. If you go back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, they saw impacts of DDT in birds, and then lo and behold, a few years later, we realized it was also causing cancer and reproductive issues in humans. And so this is a story that tends to repeat itself. But if you just kind of hone in on the micro and nanoplastics and think about reproduction, which we saw affected in the Daphnia a few slides ago, you can see a pattern developing. So in invertebrates, you see decreased fertilization. You also see that in mice. So whenever there's a little rodent in the table, it means that they've seen that in a lab study with mice. In fish, you see reduced fertilization, reduced hatching success. In frogs, you see a reduced hatching rate. And in humans, you see, in some cases, reduced sperm count or associations with reduced sperm motility. And so slowly kind of building a case, even though we don't have all of the data on micro and nanoplastics, we're building the case that there's enough information to act and to start to reduce our production. So what are we doing to try to tackle this? And again, this isn't just me just going to talk a little bit about work we're doing with Portland State, but then zoom out to talk about the global treaty and about other things happening currently in the US. But something that we're doing in collaboration with Portland State is thinking about how to mitigate all of those microfibers that are getting out into the environment. So this is funding from both Oregon Sea Grant and National Sea Grant. And it's meant to test out the addition of filters on washing machines and homes. And then a new project funded by National Sea Grant is testing out addition of filters on washing machines, dryers, and dishwashers, hopefully. We're collaborating with the iLab, so we need to design that, but and seeing how much that's reducing inputs to wastewater treatment plants. Because one load of wash can generate up to 9 million microfibers, which maybe is hard to believe. I mean, if you look at those little pieces of tape, there are so many on each of those, individual tapes that were, done maybe 2 times on someone's shirt, so maybe it is believable. And there are data that show that filters on washing machines can significantly reduce microfiber loading. There's new data that shows that dryers probably produce way more microfibers than washing machines do. And we've had some bills proposed, but they haven't passed yet. And I can answer questions about that later. But just a little bit more about this project. So One project is called MPSOS. That's the one that's focused on putting washing machine filters on households, individual households. So we've been focusing on Depot Bay and Cannon Beach. We're also working with Yachats. And then the second project on the bottom is a little bit larger, and that's the one that works with businesses in both Washington and Oregon. So we're working with hotels to design filters that go on their much larger washing machines, dryers, and dishwashers. So a lot of sampling. That's Patrick out on Depot Bay sampling stormwater very precariously. And then lots of outreach too, and getting to interact with the community, which has been fun. So that'll be ongoing for the next couple of years. And then kind of in connection with that, we've also been thinking about measuring where those microfibers are going. So a separate project that we have is looking at biosolids. And I won't spend too much time on this, not something, we want to think about a lot, but it turns out that all of those fibers, that the wastewater treatment plants are really good at removing it from effluent. But the sludge is designed to collect all the things that sink out, and that includes the microplastics and the microfibers. And in Oregon, we take those biosolids and we reuse them, which is good, but it also means that we're redeploying the stuff that sinks out. And so this is a big conversation right now because over 70% of biosolids in Oregon are applied mostly to crops that are fed to livestock, not directly to us mostly. And if you do kind of a back of the envelope calculation, we're estimating from the samples that we're analyzing, and we're finishing the study in a few months, that there's about half a microplastic particle per gram of biosolid, that there's a pretty high amount of particles being redeployed into the environment. And so we're in conversations with a wastewater treatment plant down in Eugene that actually wants to even think about retrofitting their plant to try to reduce this kind of contamination. It's a pie in the sky right now, but it's something they're thinking about. So just to summarize and to give kind of a future needs list here, which is long, we're seeing from our work and the work of others that particles become more toxic as they decrease in size, that you see effects on growth and reproduction behavior and gene expression, just like we see with other types of pollutants. So in some ways that's not big news, but we at least have a better understanding. And future research needs really need to cover longer term exposures, so like a year long, thinking about multi-generational exposures in fish and other organisms. We need better detection of the smaller particles, understand how weathering influences responses, and then strategies for avoiding regrettable substitutions. Polylactic acid, which is used to make so many things now, from straws to cups to 3D printed items, is made from plants, but it's only industrially compostable. And so right now we don't have a way to get rid of it. And so it's not necessarily bio if we don't have a way to handle it at end of life. So we need strategies for avoiding that situation, and also mitigation approaches, both downstream as well as upstream. And I'll just finish talking about what those upstream approaches might be. So right now, and the reason we have a global treaty negotiation, only 6% of plastic chemicals are regulated. And those are under some older treaties like Stockholm and Basel, but they regulate a limited number of chemicals. And so part of the point of the treaty, at least we're hoping, as the scientist coalition, is that we fill in the gaps for some of the hazard information that's missing on thousands of chemicals, and that also the bar is lowered for considering something to be toxic. So if something is persistent or bioaccumulative, or it's mobile, or it's toxic, each one of those things should be considered on its own as a reason to reduce or ban its use. And so that's something that is on kind of the wish list right now, hasn't happened yet. And the Scientist Coalition is a group of about 400 scientists across the globe that is working to increase the scientific knowledge and scientific-based decision-making of the delegates to the treaty. So we're not delegates ourselves, we're the people in the hallway handing them policy briefs and science briefs that explain why the decisions we're recommending are important. The timeline right now is a little bit long and it's going to be extended. So for the treaty negotiations, the next meeting is probably in August of 2026. I'm told by a colleague who's done this before for other treaties that this is normal. So just an update, that negotiations started in 2022. There have been, I think, 6 meetings at this point, and there is a lot of momentum there. I think there are 120 countries, depending on how you count it, that want an ambitious agreement. And then there are a few on the sidelines that make the fossil fuels that do not want an ambitious agreement. So that's where we are right now, and trying to reach consensus between those two groups is pretty difficult. But in terms of recommendations, those have been pretty consistent throughout. So needing to reduce the amount of chemicals we're producing, simplify the products we're producing so they're easier to recycle, to reuse, make less of it, and also just having incentives for change. And so there's a level playing field for countries to participate in reducing their plastic footprint too. So that's what's happening globally. In the US, not a lot happening right now, at least at the federal level. And unfortunately, in agencies, there's not a lot of movement towards plastic reduction right now. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. I think there was a bill passed earlier this year that we're going to make more plastic straws instead of less plastic straws. So anyway, well, we won't focus on that for now, but the good news is that a lot of things are happening at the state level. So Oregon is one of the first states in the country to have an extended producer responsibility bill that includes plastics. This is going to require producers to pay fees to a producer responsibility organization. So they have to be accountable for the waste that they produce. And the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is overseeing this program. So it launched in July 2025, and it kind of goes into full implementation in early 2026. And there are other states kind of following suit now. California, I think New York, and then New Jersey and Michigan are also getting into the fold. And then in addition to what's happening at the state level, in a number of different states at this point, in fact, I think yesterday there were 7 states that decided they were going to require monitoring of microplastics in drinking water, for example. And that included, I believe that included Oregon and Washington. But there are also a lot of efforts by NGOs like Five Gyres, the Ocean Conservancy, and the Pew Charitable Trusts, which I'll be moving to in a couple of weeks, on safer chemicals associated with plastics, as well as thinking about plastic production generally. In terms of safer chemicals, we have a lot of data on chemicals used in plastics like perfluorinated chemicals. And we know that they interfere with the endocrine system. We know that they are more harmful to children and to babies. And so there's a lot of momentum on trying to reduce that exposure and to kind of build, at least at the state level for now, policies that would kind of work together to reduce those exposures. And then the Breaking the Plastic Wave report, if you're interested, I put a link to it on the bottom. I should have made a QR code, but if you want to take a picture, it's there, or I can send it later. That just came out yesterday from Pew, and the Safer Chemicals program and their plastics program, which has been around for a couple of years, are set up to collaborate with one another going forward. So I will finish there. So there is some time for questions. My old and new contact information is on the bottom of the slide. I will still be courtesy faculty at OSU for at least the next 3 years to work on continuing projects and to mentor students. But yeah, happy to answer questions about anything today.
Thank you so much for sharing this work with us. We appreciate it. We're going to go to questions, and I can already see we have a question online. So, Roseanne, go ahead.
Is there any evidence of problems with other natural fibers, such as linen and wool?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has looked at wool yet, and we honestly don't find a lot of wool in our samples. I know that it biodegrades pretty quickly, I think in part because it's not generally treated with as many chemicals as cotton is. We did see when we did work with hemp that hemp could cause oxidative stress in the shrimp, but only at really high concentrations. So I think, you know, it makes sense to compare what's happening with the synthetic fibers with natural fibers and to think about how those natural fibers are treated. But I think the main focus should be on reducing synthetic fiber production. So we can't outlaw all clothing at this point. So or not recommended.
That's a different kind of conversation.
Yeah.
All right. Questions in the room. Right. 1 second. Here's
Susanne, thanks very much for the nice summary and all the wonderful work that you and your colleagues have done here, and look forward to hearing from you in the future here. Quick practical question though, just thinking about tires.
Mm-hmm.
So you can buy inexpensive tires with a 30,000 mile kind
Yep.
of thing, or 80,000 mile. Which is better, and which are do the cheap tires contribute more than the longer tires? Or what's the deal there?
Yeah, I was at a conference, a tire focus conference earlier this year, and we were having a conversation about that. The cheaper tires sometimes contain more 6 ppd than the more expensive tires, but not always. And then there's such a mixture of other chemicals in these tires that unless you're talking about the very specific case of salmonids being impacted, other fish species are not nearly as sensitive. And I think people are shifting away from thinking about just that one chemical to thinking about, the whole exposure. So it's probably better to buy the more expensive tires because overall you're going to be generating less waste. But then we also don't want to just put that on the consumer because you don't want to make people guilty because they can't afford the more expensive one. So I think the other answer is that we need to fix it at a higher level and make sure that we don't have this kind of dual, one type of tire is worse than another type of situation.
All right. Question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Is the whoops, it's rolled off the screen. Is the biodegradable plastic, such as some natural food stores use and some dog poop bags, actually a bad thing to use? Of course, it's best to reuse plastic bags that already exist instead of buying new. But if one has to use something new.
Yeah, it depends on what the bio-based plastic is. And I'm on the committee of a student who's looking at this right now, and she's looking at PHA, which is a home compostable plastic, and PLA, which is an industrially compostable. The industrially compostable plastic is almost as bad as the traditional plastic because unless you have a facility to send it to, it hangs out as long as the traditional plastic does. Like she subjected PLA and I think it was polyethylene to the same conditions, and PLA didn't break down at all, but the PHA did. So if you can get bags that say home compostable on them, and this is a lot of detail, right, for a consumer to be like reading the little fine print on the bag, but it should either say home compostable or industrially compostable, and the home compostable is better, if that makes sense. Yeah.
All right. Questions in the room. All right, Roseanne, go ahead.
What efforts are there to share this information and action goals to the general public?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good information from NGOs like Five Gyres and the Ocean Conservancy. Environmental Working Group is another really good source of information. And then Pew just released its Breaking the Plastic Wave report, which has a lot, it's written to be read by both scientists and non-scientists. And then they're planning on doing the same with their safer chemicals programs. I would say looking at some of those bigger NGOs that have been working a while in the plastic space is a really, following them on social media, on Instagram or Blue Sky or whatever is a really good way to get up-to-date information.
Okay, question in the room.
Yeah, I'm curious about the filters for the washers and dryers. Are they available to the American consumer?
Yeah.
And why did they not pass? Why did the bills not pass? What was the issue?
That is a long story. Well, okay, so I put this slide back up because the Filtrol is available. You can purchase it online. I think it's like 120, 140 bucks. We have one at our house and we've had it for 5 years, and we have 2 kids and 5 cats, and it still works. So it's pretty easy to install if you have enough space in your laundry room. You just kind of have to mount it on the wall above your washer, and it collects anything that is bigger than 100 microns, which is pretty good. In terms of why it didn't pass, industry opposition. Myself and Elise Granick from Portland State, we testified at one of the hearings in Salem, and we didn't know this was going to happen, but someone from, it was like the National Washing Machine Association, a guy came on Zoom, he had a suit and tie, and he had a whole list of reasons why the washing machine filters are going to cause people's houses to flood and water bills to go up. And a few of the folks in the legislature believed him rather than listening to the data, and that's essentially why it didn't pass in Oregon, and that's happened twice. And then California, it almost passed, and then Governor Newsom vetoed the bill this past year. We're not sure why, but I think he's eyeing the presidency potentially. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons, mostly political, and also industry opposition. Yeah.
Okay, Roseanne, you got another one.
How much of all plastic produced is fiber? Clothes, for example, must be a tiny part of all plastic. Are the other kinds of plastic growing at the same rate as microplastic sources, or are they also a likely major source?
Yeah, they're also a likely major source. I think for some of the other plastic types, they're much denser, and so they sink out more quickly. And so because a lot of the sampling is done in the water column, we're not finding as much of it. In terms of the percent of plastic being produced that's textiles, I don't have that stat. I do know that 65% of textiles produced are synthetic. And that's been increasing for a while. I think it's increased like 6-fold since the early 1980s or so. So it's a huge issue. But yeah, what we're detecting is probably an underestimation of what's actually out there. And we're detecting the things that are easiest to find, I think, in some cases.
All right, we are at time, and so I want to hand this back to Suzanne. Anything you want to leave us with? Any last thoughts as you wrap up what you're doing here with us and transition?
Sure, and again, I will be still, advising current students and finishing up some projects. We have a project with the DEQ looking at compost and other sample types. I guess what I would leave people with is that there's still hope, and there are a lot of people working to try to make this better. It feels like an absolutely insurmountable problem, but at one point we all existed without this much plastic. And so we can do it again. I think it just is going to take systemic change, and I think it's going to take that at least a certain number of countries, maybe not all, supporting a global regulatory effort. But that is certainly not, it's far from being over, and it's still progressing.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Can we give one more round of applause? All right, everyone. Thank you very much. I think it's raining out there now, so drive safe.